I think that PTSD is fascinating. It's a truly tragic condition, what happens when biological and psychological factors are pushed to their extreme. It demonstrates the fragility of identity and the depth of emotion that the human mind can endure. But at the same time, the associated imagery makes it a really evocative tool for storytelling. It's one of the most commonly portrayed conditions in media, and when I started to think about just how much my perception of the world is shaped by that media consumption, I began to realize that I actually don't know anything about PTSD. What actually is PTSD? It's naturally complicated, and beyond giving a very broad strokes definition that I think we all already are familiar with, anything more specific requires us to determine what kind of answer we're looking for. If we want a strict definition, we need to contend with the fact that PTSD, or any condition of the mind, is not a simple or exclusive mechanism by one part of the mind. It's the interactions of really complex systems both in and outside of the body. Resultingly, these definitions must instead be descriptive in nature. They must be an agreed upon set of boundaries to sort of point out its existence. And thinking about it in terms of boundaries actually helped me to understand it on a more intuitive level. See, I started to think about human behavior as like a graph or a grid with different actions lying on different points here. Mental disorders are shapes in this graph, and it's the job of the definition to draw its boundaries. The thing is that the edges of these shapes are fuzzy and indistinct. They overlap and intermingle, which is why it's hard. And so the boundaries around these conditions, they change, they update. It's our best approximation. Right now, there are generally two accepted sources on this topic. There's the DSM-5, as handled by the American Psychiatric Association, and the ICD-11, as handled by the World Health Organization. They agree on most things, the broad strokes being that the DSM-5 is a little bit less restrictive, whereas the ICD-11 has one sort of key specific that I'll get into later. But before that, I want to take a quick detour. You might be in frame.
I don't think I actually am.
Manchester by the Sea is a 2016 drama film that highlights the human complexities of loss and trauma. I'd also consider it to be one of, if not my favorite movie of all time. It follows Lee Chandler, a man somewhere in his 30s or early 40s. He lives alone in a basement apartment, spending his days working as a janitor and a handyman. But it's clear from his first moments on screen that Lee is struggling. He moves through his days with an almost empty affect. He could be praised or demeaned or desired, and it seems to make no difference to him. A plaster numb interrupted by flashes of violent anger. Something has deeply hollowed Lee Chandler. One day he receives a call to discover that his brother, Joe, has passed away. He faces the aftermath with blank pragmatism. His every word with family in the hospital centers the next steps. In the following days, Lee is summoned to the reading of Joe's will, where he discovers himself to have been appointed as Patrick's legal guardian. And it's in this scene where a flashback shows us the man that he once was. Because years ago, Lee had had a family, a wife and 3 kids. And these short scenes paint a really vivid picture for just how much he cared for them. In his words and tone, we see Lee as a family man. The love in his eyes and joy on his face is nothing like the Lee of the present. But at the same time, he was immature, almost childish. Lee is not quite on top of things. He's a little bit scatterbrained, and he spends too many nights out late partying with his friends. It's past 2 a.m. after one of these late nights that Lee finds himself sitting alone in the living room, watching TV with a fireplace burning by his side. High on a mix of alcohol, weed, and cocaine, he decides to walk to the liquor store, tossing a few logs in the fireplace on his way out. And halfway there, he realizes that he can't remember if he put a screen on the fireplace, which he didn't. The house is in flames, a crowd has gathered, and his wife, Randy, is being dragged away by the cops, yelling for her kids who are still trapped inside. Lee stands there, frozen, one face in the crowd, bottles of beer still clutched to his chest. As night drags into day, Lee wanders about with that same expression, confusion and fear and complete and utter despair. Randy is pulled away in a stretcher, and Lee watches as firemen carry the bodies of his 3 daughters from the wreckage. He's taken to the police station, where he tells them everything that he can. It is a painful scene. The camera slowly zooms in on his face as he goes through this agonizingly slow description, step by step, from party to house fire. In his eyes, you can see that something has died. He's being eaten alive by the type of grief and guilt that could never leave him. But the thing is that whether he should be blamed or not, there was no crime committed. Only a mistake, one for which there is no recourse. By all legal means, Lee is a free man.
Not a crime to forget to put the screen on the fireplace.
This is the Lee that we get to see in the present of Manchester by the Sea, still wearing the face from all those years ago. I would highly recommend watching Manchester by the Sea for yourself. It is a really well done film, and despite the spoilers that I've given, it's worth watching nonetheless. The reason I talk about it here is because I want to give imagery to what these conditions mean, what they mean to a person. So with that in mind, how does the condition apply? Let's take a look at Lee through the lens of these two different criteria, starting with the DSM-5. It has 8 criteria labeled A through H. A is, put most simply, the traumatic exposure. It requires the exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence. To this, clearly, Lee does apply. B is the intrusion symptoms, and this is an important thing to keep in mind when we're thinking about PTSD. Traumatic memories are, I would argue, the hallmark aspect of PTSD. And they come along with really an intense degree of psychological distress. This category also contains what you might know as a flashback, which is essentially when the traumatic memories come back in such a way that it feels like the event is reoccurring in the present. The emotions and the pain, the sensations from that time come back. Already, this category shows us some sort of the limitations we're working with here, which is that we can't read Lee's mind. In a clinical context, that would matter, but Lee is a fictional character, so, I don't mind making these assumptions. And I'm also trying to diagnose him under these criteria. I'm specifically seeking out examples. It is very possible that PTSD is not the best description for Lee, that it could be some kind of depression or some kind of PTSD with other comorbidities. If we apply this criteria to Lee, we can see some examples. So first we have the interaction with Joe's lawyer, and whether the flashbacks that we see as the viewer there are filmmaking or plot is not strictly known, but it's heavily implied. And if we take it as a real flashback in that moment, it would fit under the criteria. However, a much more damning, or I suppose convincing scene is this one, in which Lee is having a dream where he's sitting next to his daughter as she says that she smells smoke. Criterion C refers to avoidance of stimuli associated with the event. So that could be people, places, or things, anything that reminds the person of that event. Within the movie, I would argue that his location in Quincy is indicative of that. The reason that he struggles to move back to his hometown is because the place is too painful for him to be in, not because he's got so many deep roots in Quincy. Criterion D is perhaps the most direct fit. Negative alterations in cognition or mood associated with the event, markedly diminished interest or participation in significant activities, persistent inability to experience positive emotions. I feel like it's fairly self-explanatory. Then there's E, which I would argue is the sort of final key determinant, described as marked alterations in arousal or reactivity associated with the traumatic event. Arousal in this context meaning more of a general state of alertness. Within this description, you could see his angry outbursts, sort of his emotional reactions as cues towards this. The last 3 criteria, F, G, and H, basically just define that the condition must have, existed for some amount of time, must cause serious negative impairments in day-to-day life, and is not, the result of some other drug or psychiatric condition. Then we get to the ICD-11 description, which is broadly very similar. The main distinction is that it defines intrusive memories, these intrusion symptoms, in a different way. It defines them specifically as occurring in the present. And that is the nuance that makes it a tighter description, even though it only has 3 key determinants compared to the 8 of the DSM-5. It's just written in a different way. That specific difference is what matters. The other 2 that it requires are hypervigilance type symptoms and avoidance type symptoms, both of which I've already discussed with regards to Lee. Realized really quickly that I should mention something that had to get cut for time, which is complex PTSD. There's a lot of stuff that I've researched and would have loved to talk about, but just didn't have the time. Essentially, if you've heard of CPTSD or complex PTSD, this is a separate diagnosis that is only recognized by the ICD-11. The DSM-5 does not have it as a separate condition, and it's defined for cases in which the traumatic exposure is an extended string of events which are hard or difficult to escape from, versus inciting specific incidents. So here it's listed for things like torture, domestic violence, sexual assault, childhood sexual assault, that kind of thing. It causes some slightly different symptoms, more in relation to the way that somebody views themselves and their relationships. I don't really have the time to get into it, but I figure it's definitely worth mentioning. So from this, I guess we can conclude that Lee heavily demonstrates a lot of the symptoms that are indicative of PTSD. He's one example of many. So now that we sort of understand what PTSD looks like, we've got this common ground understanding, we need to actually answer the question of the video, which is, what actually is PTSD, but for real this time? Let's talk a little bit about the theories surrounding it, most of which center memory.
It all starts with a traumatic event, and this event can stem from many different causes, but there are some clear trends. Sexual violence, for example, is a lot more common than a natural disaster to be a catalyst of PTSD. But regardless of what situation is occurring, what matters is what's going on inside the head. The brain surges with stress hormones as the afflicted person experiences an overwhelming intensity of emotion, mostly fear. See, not all memories are created equally, and I think this is something we all know. I mean, we remember some things better than others. And a lot of the reason for this is the flow of neurotransmitters, that careful balance. So when that balance is thrown so far into disturbance, it creates issues. The memory is encoded in a fundamentally different way than a normal memory. A good quote here. They, so the memories, tend to be encoded in predominantly sensory modalities, with a fragmented and disorganized sequencing, thereby reducing the likelihood that the memory is adequately embedded into one's autobiographical memory base. I know, a lot of words, but it is key to understanding how this whole theory functions. See, in normal memory, it's sort of one thing. It exists in a place of time. It's one discrete moment. That's not how trauma forms. Trauma is fragmented. It exists outside of time, in a place that never goes away. And these fragments can be triggered by different things. They become cues. Anything that reminds the person of that incident leads back to that same memory. That memory, which is encoded through these sensory modalities, through the methods of fear and pain, through that bodily sensation, through the panic. The memory doesn't go away as we distance ourselves from it in time. It stays in the here and now, and when it's triggered, it appears in the here and now. That is what makes PTSD so debilitating. It's that repeated fear over and over again. Because the other thing that we see is that when we analyze the brains of people with PTSD, there are some common differences. It's associated with changes in neural circuitry associated with fear processing. So the amygdala, the prefrontal cortex, and the hippocampus. They also found strong associations with noradrenergic dysregulation, noradrenaline being the fight or flight hormone, which adds evidence to that neurological imbalance theory permitting these disordered structures. And again, we need to remember that it's inconclusive as to whether these changes occur from PTSD or whether they are risk factors for PTSD. Probably a combination of both. Put all together, it implicates the idea of extinction processing, which is the method by which new data slowly extinguishes a fear response. So when this processing circuitry isn't working the right way, or the magnitude of the fear response is just too big, this process just doesn't occur in the same way. So that's what PTSD is doing. It is our natural learning and defense mechanisms pushed past their breaking point, to the point where they no longer function anymore. So, if these memories are so deeply etched in stone, then what actually can be done about it? Well, for one thing, you have medications. So the most commonly prescribed medication with PTSD is an SSRI, so a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. However, it's also important to keep in mind that SSRIs are really commonly prescribed for depression and anxiety, which are some of the most common comorbidities of PTSD. You also have SNRIs, which function pretty similarly to SSRIs, but with moderate or slightly less effective results. And then also there's some experimental evidence to suggest that immediate chemical interventions within a short period after the trauma has been experienced might be able to prevent the encoding of the memory in that way, either by preventing the memory from forming at all or by repairing it in some way. I don't know. Just thought that was interesting. But either way, medications really just aren't silver bullet solutions. Instead of medications, most successful PTSD treatment is focused on different types of psychotherapies. So there's a variety of different ones used, a lot of specifics that I could go into. Broadly, it's stuff like trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapies or exposure therapies. So you have stuff like EMDR, which is eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. Either way, they all sort of focus around exposing the person to their traumas, exposing them to their cues, and then trying to work through damping down the response from it. But the thing is that while these are the most successful, they're far from perfect. There are a sizable minority of people who don't respond well to these treatments. And of the people who do, remission and partial responses are common. There are a lot of people who just can't find peace from their condition, the peace that they deserve. It's a research field that really just needs better answers, better solutions. And the thing is that it honestly is a really interesting domain of research. I thoroughly enjoyed looking through all the papers, and I'll leave some links in the description to some of the stuff I found most interesting. But I would highly encourage anyone who found this video entertaining in some sort to do some more research into it. I hope this video served as some kind of introduction to clarify the discussion. I know I at least learned a lot, so I guess the rest is up to you. Thanks for watching.